Thank you for tuning into this episode of Politics for Parents. And this is going to be a little bit of a wonky one, but I think it's important because if you're a parent, you probably care about your child's education. And there have been a lot of gripping headlines this summer about the Department of Education and what's going on there. There have been layoffs of people at the Federal Department of Education, but there's also been a lot of rhetoric and confusion around what the Department of Education actually does, who the people are that are being laid off, and what the impact of this development will be on the schools. So I spoke to Kevin Welner. He is a research professor focused on education policy and law at the University of Colorado Boulder. And he's an expert on the Department of Education and what the department actually does, why the department was started, and what these professionals do who are at risk of being laid off from the Department of Education now that, the Supreme Court has allowed this process to move forward. And the Trump administration has made it very clear that they plan to move forward with their, goal of eliminating the department altogether. So I hope this is informative for you and helps you figure out the path forward. I can't emphasize enough that the federal Department of Education plays a role in education in many ways. However, a ton of power rests at your local and state levels. If you are not happy with the education your child is getting in your public school, you need to know who's on your school board. You need to know who your state representatives are, and how they can make decisions about policy that impact funding, et cetera, of your schools. So make sure that you're aware of how your local district operates, who is in charge of what, and how you can really advocate for your children. Thanks. Okay, so Kevin Welner, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today and set the record straight as to what is happening with the Department of Education. There's been a lot of concerning headlines and interesting rhetoric around the issue, so I'm really happy to talk to someone who actually knows what's going on at the department, how it operates, and kind of illuminate us here a little bit as to where we stand right today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I do not claim to know what's going on inside the Department of Education right now.
Okay.
I'll do my best.
All right. Based on your knowledge, you have more knowledge than I do on the DOE. Most people listening. So that in and of itself will be helpful. So you are a research professor focused on education policy and law at the University of Colorado at Boulder. You're a director of the National Education Policy Center, housed at CU Boulder, which works to build bridges between the research world and the broader public. So thank you so much for your work, I think, for everything you do. And I'd love to just have you kick it off with a little bit of a background on your professional background and kind of what it is that you do so that everyone understands kind of the perspective you bring and the knowledge you bring to this conversation.
Sure. Very briefly, I started off as a lawyer, practiced law in Los Angeles before going back to UCLA where I got my JD. For a PhD in education policy. And so my work since then has all been in this realm of education policy and law, primarily focused on educational equity issues. I've done a lot of work over the last dozen years on what I call opportunity gaps, which is if we think about the test score gaps or the achievement gaps that oftentimes are discussed in the media, underlying those are opportunity gaps.
Right.
People learn when they have opportunities to learn. Children certainly included among those people. And so when we enrich those opportunities to learn, students learn more. And when we water down those opportunities to learn, students learn less. Pretty straightforward stuff, but it has a lot of implications. If we use that as our lens to understand what's going on, it has a lot of implications for education policy and for what we should expect out of our schools.
I would certainly agree with all of that. And I think one of the things that I think about with the DOE is just all the programs they offer to kind of hit upon the points that you raised, providing opportunity, which is what I see in my community as well as in my own personal life through federal loan programs and things like that. So I'd love to get an update from you on where things stand with the DOE today. We all know that Doge came in and Linda McMahon came in and they were like, we're getting rid of it. We're firing everyone. They're all gone. And then I think some lawyers like yourself got involved and said, hold on, that's not okay. And then the Supreme Court came and said, I guess it is okay. And then the last I heard, a lot of people were waiting for pink slips. So what is happening?
Okay. Well, let me start with just a very brief description of what Congress has asked the Department of Education to do.
Yeah.
And then I'll get in a little bit into that Supreme Court case and what's I understand to be happening right now. So you mentioned student loans. Student loans and Pell Grants are a big part of what the Department of Education does in addition to accrediting colleges. So
Okay.
it's at the higher education level, those are three really big things. Loans and Pell Grants, if you actually look at the dollar figures of money going through the Department of Education, those are the biggest numbers. At the K-12 level, the two largest programs are the Title I program, which
Right.
focuses on students in low-income families, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act,
Okay.
or IDEA, which focuses on students with disabilities. Many of the programs that are funded there are funded at smaller levels, but are also extremely important, such as addressing issues like mental health, vocational education, after school programming, teacher preparation, instruction for English learners, instruction for students experiencing homelessness, rural
Yes.
education, community schools, magnet schools, et cetera, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that the Federal Department of Education does in terms of funding, even though education is primarily funded through local, usually property taxes, local revenues, and state revenues. The federal government provides somewhere between 10 and 13% of
Right.
education funding, depending on what you put in the numerator and particularly what you put in the denominator. But the Department of Education also does other things that are important, and I'll just list two of them here. One of them is data gathering and research, which is through what's called the Institute for Education Sciences, or IES. So that oversees education statistics, research, and evaluation.
Yep.
And then the Office of Civil Rights, which
Hmm.
other things investigates alleged violations of federal anti-discrimination laws. And those last two, IES and OCR, seem to have taken especially deep cuts in terms of staffing and budget, but also some of those smaller areas have been devastated. Even though they aren't big dollar amounts, they've been largely zeroed out.
Right. And I
And I
was
should add,
talking to
by
one
the
of
way,
my
that
friends who's a vice principal recently, and she was like, well, if they do all these cuts and they want people to report teachers who are teaching woke stuff, they're gutting the very department that would investigate any of those civil rights infractions. So it really makes no sense.
there's a lot that's inconsistent in what's happening. I do think there are a few through lines that we could follow, but there definitely is some inconsistency or arguably even hypocrisy
Mhm.
in terms of what's being said and what's being done. I should add that another place where there have been deep cuts is the one you mentioned initially, which is the staffing overseeing the student loan program. But you asked about, so in terms of where things stand right now. So a little over 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a court order that had been issued by a federal judge in Massachusetts. The court order was one of these national injunctions affecting what happened across the entire country. It blocked the reductions, so that the underlying court order stopped the riffing or the reduction in force, the layoffs
Right.
of these staff in the U.S. Department of Education, which affected about a third of the U.S. Department of Education staff. There were other staff members who took a sort of a voluntary retirement sort of program
Right.
before that. So overall, we saw the Department of Education staffing reduced by about half.
Okay.
And what the underlying federal judge had decided and had found as a factual matter was that those cuts had made it effectively impossible for the U.S. Department of Education to carry out its legally required responsibilities the Congress put into the law. So after the court's order, and then until about 2 weeks ago when the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, and I'll explain that decision a little bit in just a second. So those employees were all on paid administrative leave. That 1/3 of
Okay.
staffing. So the department has already been understaffed,
Okay.
really since, what was it, March, I think, when that hit. So the administration can now move forward with those terminations while the litigation proceeds. So what the Supreme Court did is it lifted the injunction, but the underlying litigation, not just that Massachusetts case, but there are several other lawsuits making similar allegations across the country. The underlying litigation will now continue, but what an injunction does is it sort of keeps the current situation in place while the litigation proceeds. So now if the plaintiffs win against the administration, a year or 2 years from now, what does that really mean? What impact could it have? Well, it have, because the Department of Education will already have been largely dismantled. So that's a very brief overview of where we stand.
Well, I mean, that's helpful because it's hard to get that understanding from a lot of the media that's out there
Mhm.
around it, nor do people like myself, busy working parents, have time to really sift through all of this. So I'd love to go, since basically these people have been laid off or fired, and to your point, half the workforce at the DOE has already been basically pushed out. So the department is already understaffed. I'd love to hear from you, from your understanding of DOE. What are some of these jobs that were cut? I know you mentioned, let's start with the student loan program. If I have a question about my repayment plan, if I'm on an income-based repayment plan and I just get a notice saying that's over, you got to pay this amount, like who can I call? Are people answering phones, or like what are these professionals that have been let go in that department?
So I can't speak specifically to, I know that was one of the departments that had the most people let go. I would anecdotally, I know that what you're describing is happening, that people try to reach the department and have difficulty getting their questions answered. The law of key employees and a loss of overall staffing will always degrade capacity, right? So
Right.
imagine what would happen to any major enterprise you could think of that lost half of its employees, your local
Yeah.
grocery store, bank, church, factory, university, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily mean that all of these institutions would cease to function, but
Yeah.
it does mean that they would function a lot less well. Out of all the cabinet level departments, the US Department of Education started out with the smallest number of employees,
Mm-hmm.
with only about 4,000 people working there when Trump took office. So losing about half of those employees will undoubtedly kneecap their ability to carry out their work. So imagine if you're working in the US Department's Office of Special Education, trying to make sure that or imagine you're working in the state Department of Education. Which state are you in, Nicole?
New Jersey.
Yeah. So imagine you're working in the New Jersey Department of Education, right? And working on special education and trying to make sure that that state's school districts get their funding and can educate their students with disabilities. But the people they're working with in DC, and have worked with them, they're gone. The same question regarding parents and student loans, or regarding people working in vocational education, or regarding Title I funding, it's all going to be about the same.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a prospective student or a parent trying to get answers regarding, a prospective higher education student, a college applicant, and you want to get information regarding a possible student loan or a Pell Grant. Who's going to answer those questions? Will it derail your plans? And then we doesn't even get to, who's going to conduct the key research that Congress has asked the Department of Education to undertake, or to who's going to investigate complaints of discrimination based on religious beliefs or disability or sex or ethnicity. Most OCR cases involve special education. So now it looks like many of these families won't have anyone to turn to in OCR. So yes, I could go on, but you could see how all those different functions are important to different people across the country.
Right. And I think of it just, I mean, most of us who haven't worked in government have certainly worked in a corporate type setting where, if you've been on a team and there's a layoff and suddenly you're thankful that you've kept your job, but your entire workforce was cut in half. Imagine, people try and keep up with that workflow. I mean, that's kind of what's happening here. And then if you're on the other side of it, right, if you work for a company that depends on clients and perception of the market, and you've then gone and laid off half your staff, do people have confidence in you, your ability to continue to perform your functions? So that, I mean, to me, that's kind of like, as a parent, what I'm concerned with here, specifically, with friends that work in Title I school districts, or with my friends that have children that do have disabilities that benefit from programming. I was able to access, student loan programs because of my background that hopefully remain in place, but that's how I got through college. So these are the things that everyone's thinking about, and I appreciate you underscoring it. I just want to go back to one thing you said, though, is that so the DOE has one of the smallest workforces of all the cabinets, which I think is important because this is all about cutting costs, I thought.
Yeah, so they're down to about 2,000 employees, and that's
Okay.
across the country. That's not just those in DC.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that they've hit a little bit on these research roles too. And they kind of try to portray these as people that aren't really doing anything. They add to the bureaucratic bloat. So what are some of these researchers that have let go from the research arm of the DOE? What is it that they do? What is like how do they contribute to the public discourse and our understanding around education policy and what works, what doesn't, et cetera? What's the value of having those roles?
So the way IES works, the research arm, the way it used to work, is that they have a very, very limited staffing in terms of employees, but
Okay.
a high number of contracts that they enter into with researchers across the country.
Okay.
Some of those are immediate contracts pursuant to a proposal to conduct research for a particular study. A
Mhm.
lot of them are ongoing contracts regarding um, the studies that what are called longitudinal studies that the Department of Education has carried
Right.
out over the years. So when we hear about the quote nation's report card in the
Yes.
headlines we see every year or every other
Yes.
year, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. And so the Department of Education, the IES, will contract with researchers outside the department in private industry to carry out a lot of that work. And there are also plenty of surveys that the Department of Education will contract with researchers to conduct that help us to understand who is in our school, what needs, how well things are going. Every bit of data that researchers use to figure out, not every bit. In
Okay.
terms of national, if you think about, Colorado, where I live, we can conduct a study here in Colorado. The state can conduct a study, but that doesn't let us compare or understand what's going on next door in Utah or New Mexico or in Arizona or
Right.
Nebraska. And so what the federal IES does is it lets us understand what's happening nationally in
Okay.
terms of a snapshot of what's going on right now, but also in terms of the patterns that we're seeing emerging in terms of how well things are going. So you might remember all the headlines coming out after the COVID-19 pandemic, the school
Mhm.
closures, et cetera. The way we were able to understand the impact of COVID on students was through IES research.
And it sounds actually quite efficient because it sounds like they're actually outsourcing a lot of the research, day-to-day research functions. And these professionals are the folks who oversee that the work is being done, making
Yes.
sure it's done appropriately. And actually, I guess, in a way, ensuring that our dollars are being used well and wisely. So it sounds like quite an efficient model. So if you're really looking to boost government efficiency, this doesn't really seem like the way to do it because there wasn't a ton of bloat, it sounds like.
My understanding is there's not, I mean, as Nicole, as you know, in any major institution, you're going to be able to find inefficiencies.
Yes.
You're going to be able to find all sorts of problems.
Yes.
And I imagine those existed and still exist within the Department of Education,
Yeah.
within IES, within really any significant institution. But yes, the way you describe it is basically the way it's been carried out. And I think you'd find that the Department of Education, or IES in particular, is among the most efficient, or has been among the most efficiently run organizations.
So you mentioned, your state of Colorado, my state of New Jersey. And what I've heard you talk about in other discussions that I've watched is that like this whole project is about dismantling the federal role in education and returning it back to the states. And you've raised the point that that means that this is probably going to play out very differently in different states. And I'd love for you to talk about that for a minute so people actually understand what could potentially happen in their state. And I also, the reason I like to focus here is because if this is all coming back to the states, I think the state level is where folks have a really tremendous opportunity to get involved in their own state government. You can call your state senator sometimes and get them on the phone in some places. So
Uh-huh.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit now as how you see this playing out in different states if this vision comes to fruition and the
Uh-huh.
DOE is kind of removed and the federal government's removed.
Yeah. Well, something we didn't touch on that I think a lot of us have heard mentioned in the media is that the Congress created the U.S. Department of Education.
Mhm.
Congress created the programs that we're talking about that are administered through the U.S. Department of Education. And so if you asked me to answer certain questions several months ago, I'd probably answer them differently than I would answer now, because the simple answer several months ago is, well, Congress created the Department of Education. The Trump administration cannot close it by executive order, and it can't effectively eliminate it by executive action.
Mhm.
What we've seen, though, and by the way, Donald Trump and Secretary McMahon have both acknowledged that they cannot legally close down the Department of Education by
Right.
themselves. It takes a congressional action. And the same thing with regard to a given program that Congress has created and funded.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution requires the executive, Trump and McMahon, to take care to carry out those laws. So several months ago, I would have said that's sort of a nice, simple legal answer. But what we've seen is that the U.S. Supreme Court has not stood up to the administration when the administration takes these actions that are declared by lower courts to be unconstitutional or illegal. And so at this point, with my legal hat on, I don't know how to answer a lot of these questions about what's going to happen in terms of what the administration can do legally and essentially and get away with. Having said that, I do think it's important to stress that Congress created these programs. The legal requirement of the Trump administration is to keep the department open, to keep it functioning, and to take care to administer the programs. And that includes the larger K-12 programs we talked about, Title I and IDEA. You mentioned the fact that these programs play out differently in different states, and that cuts might play out differently in different states, or the elimination of the Department of Education might. That's in part because some states are much more reliant on the federal government. So I mentioned that the federal government provides about 10 to 13% of the funding for K-12 education, depending on how it's measured. And that varies from state to state. So in Mississippi, the number jumps to over 23% of money for K-12 coming from the federal government. But in New York, it's only 7.3%.
Yeah.
Right? So less than a third of the amount as Mississippi. Part of the difference is explained by the fact that Mississippi receives more money per student from the federal government, $500 more per student than New York does. But the main difference is explained by very different contributions locally, state and local contributions. So New York spends over $33,000 per K-12 student. Mississippi spends less than $13,000. So the federal contribution is much more important to Mississippi. And there's a red-blue pattern that's particularly stark. So it's not just New York and New York blue, Mississippi red. Only 2 states do not fit the pattern I just described. New Mexico, which is a blue state, relies quite a bit on federal support.
Okay.
And Kansas, which is a red state, relies on a percentage of federal support that's significantly below the national average. But other than that, you see this really stark pattern among red and blue states. And that's largely because red states tend to be more conservative and rural and rely more on federal money, particularly Title I, which recall it helps serve students from low-income families.
Of course.
It's used to pay for critical instructional needs in these states like teachers and tutors and after-school programs. So yeah, and in Alaska, I did some research looking at different places. In Alaska, there are quite a few school districts in rural areas of Alaska that receive more than $10,000 in federal funding per pupil.
Wow.
So it could really impact, for your listeners, in Alaska. This is really important. Now there's a question as to what the Trump administration is going to do with regard to Title I spending. Project 2025 called for Title I spending to be initially block granted. In other words,
yes,
sort of deregulated.
That was my next question to you.
Okay, well, I'm jumping right ahead. And then it calls for the funding to essentially be phased out. So that would really hit these red states.
Well, I feel like when the members of this administration have been really pressed by folks saying, no, you're cutting funding to students who really need it, that's where they shift. And they say, oh, no, we're not cutting the funding. We're shifting from this federal grant program to the block grants, and we're going to give it directly to the states. So the states can do what they want with it. So just from your perspective, understanding education in this way that you do with the administration aspect of it, I mean, that to me just doesn't sound logistically like a sound argument. But what are your thoughts when they say that?
So block granting of federal money has taken place over the years. A lot of the transitions from programs to block grants, or programs with more guidelines to block grants, happened during the 80s, during the Reagan years. And those were studied. We know sort of how those played out. The main thing that we've learned from that research is that once money is block granted, it tends to get combined with other specific programs and reduced in funding. So block granting is sort of a way to reduce the overall amount that goes to the states. In fact, some of the Trump proposals to eliminate money that Reagan had initially block granted. So it's sort of this pattern. And the Project 2025 approach of saying block grant and then phase it out is also consistent with that. There are also concerns about block grant money not getting to the students who need it. And there's some evidence of that in the research, but the main research finding is this phasing out issue.
Yeah. And since you bring up Project 2025, one of the things I was looking at when this all started, I went and read their chapter on education, since it's been clear that they're really following that playbook. The education section relied a lot on vouchers, and they championed some questionable models. I can't recall off top of my mind which ones they were saying are models that they want to follow, but they were states where they are shifting drastically towards a voucher system as opposed to like a state aid or what we've done traditionally. And then when I looked at how those states ranked, they weren't good. So that also seems like a flaw in the argument to me.
Yeah, the research on vouchers, which you'll hear different terms used: scholarship programs, vouchers, school choice sometimes is a sort of a general term. But we're talking, when I say vouchers, we're talking about public money going to subsidize private school tuition. So no matter, I'll just use vouchers as shorthand, but that's what that's referring to. And there are different ways that different types of programs that do that, including one that was just put in place through the Reconciliation Act in DC, through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that was not paid, we didn't get a lot of attention paid to it, but it was a pretty big deal, is that there is this, they call it tax credit scholarship program that was created through the Reconciliation Act. I could get into the details if you want, but it's a program that different states can choose whether or not they want to opt into. But there are financial and political incentives to push even blue states to do that. So that's something that we as citizens and parents should be keeping an eye on.
And I'm sorry, so those are scholarships. So it's a tax credit scholarship program, but it's designed to, I guess, provide a tax credit to families that send their children to private school, or?
Not quite. So the way it works, I'll run through it as quickly as I can.
Okay, yeah.
So
I just feel like
let's say you have to owe a certain amount of money, although you can carry some of it forward from year to year, but you can donate up to $1,700 of the federal taxes that you owe. So you're sitting in New Jersey, you don't have a school choice, a voucher plan in your state, but you can donate $1,700 to what's called a school tuition, or tuition granting organization, scholarship granting organization, SGO is what they're calling it.
Okay.
And a scholarship granting organization is a nonprofit that's set up in a given state. So I'm going to assume that New Jersey, I don't think they will, but let's assume that New Jersey opts into this plan. They would authorize the creation of these SGOs. You would then donate your $1,700 to the SGO, and you get a dollar for dollar tax credit off your federal taxes. So essentially what you're doing is you're shifting the $1,700 from your federal taxes to this SGO. The SGO then pools that money and gives it to families, to students who apply and who they want to, who they agree to give the money to. That money can then be used for a variety of purposes. The same list of purposes that the current Coverdale scholarships are authorized to spend money on. So that includes everything from transportation and books to tutoring to private school tuition. Now, there's a question, this is really important, that the law was written at the last minute. It was one of those that the Senate parliamentarian dinged and they had to go back and change. It was written in a very skimpy way with a lot of holes in it. And the U.S. Department of Treasury, the Treasury Secretary, will have to issue regulations that will go through the rulemaking process. There'll be a public comment period where you and I and others can comment on those proposed regulations. And that will try to fill in some of the gaps. And then there might be litigation challenging what the U.S. Department of Treasury decides to do. It's Treasury because it's done through the tax code, not through the Department of Education.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't prepare a streamlined version of this, but hopefully you're getting the idea.
No, but that's the kind of stuff that I think is important to understand. One, we have our state elections in New Jersey this fall. So I actually think, depending on who's elected to the governor's seat, as well as what happens in our state Senate, And assembly, I mean, we could have different views on that, and we actually could end up being a red state that goes down the path of that. And I think, this is the interesting thing and why I'm fine getting in these deep dive policy discussions, because what you said doesn't sound so bad, right? It's a scholarship program. And you can cover every type of expense a student incurs if they want to go to the best private school. However, we understand that there's political and ideological motivations behind it, and the way that these things are actually written and the details that are put in place and who oversees all of it can mean that there's different things
Yes.
that play out.
The Trump administration, we talked earlier about the rhetoric and the things that have actually been done. The rhetoric is hugely about sending education back to the states. The states is, the federal government shouldn't be acting as a national superintendent or school board, and the states should be where all these decisions are made. And yet we're talking about this program being imposed. Now there is a state opt-in, right?
Yep.
And get into the question of why a state might choose to opt in or not. But the key thing to keep in mind is if the Trump administration is serious about this idea of devolving power back to the states, then each state should be able to make its set of rules. In other words, the Treasury Department regulations should give a lot of flexibility to New Jersey or Colorado or Kentucky or anywhere else to design this program in ways that are consistent with the values of that state and make sure that the money is being spent in ways that are consistent with the values of that state and the educational policy of that state. I'm not particularly confident that the regulations coming out of Treasury will do that, but if they're consistent with the rhetoric, then that's what we should expect to see.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But since you mentioned rhetoric, it's been really interesting to watch the language around this. People heard they were dismantling the DOE. People started freaking out. Like, that sounds like a terrible idea. It's education. We should be promoting education. And then we've seen a lot of justification. So I want to run through a few of these by you to see if this is actually what the DOE cuts are going to achieve. One of the things they talk about is getting the woke out of the schools, and they talk a lot about curriculum. So will these cuts achieve anything in terms of getting the woke out of curriculums that people may be upset about? Is that what these are going to do?
It's hard to answer that because I think we all have a different idea about woke. Getting woke out of the curriculum.
Will it really impact the curriculum in your kid's school?
Yeah. Well, okay. So keep in mind that even setting aside the Trump rhetoric on sending authority back to the states, states have always had control over their own curriculum, right? So states and school boards, local control is in our state constitution here in Colorado, for example. The federal government has a very, very limited role in terms of the curriculum and should have a very limited role in terms of the curriculum. You might remember back in the Obama years, there was this push for national, what did they call it? National standards, national academic standards. And I'm blanking on the name of them. It's funny, it's been so long. It's only been a decade and I'm already forgetting the name.
It's been a long decade.
But it was, it has. But anyway, there was a huge pushback on just that. And it was a fairly mild version of a federal push for academic standards to be consistent across the country. So the role of the federal government in curriculum has always been limited. It is limited. It will always will be limited, is my guess. Having said that, there are things that the federal government has done and can do to impact what is taught in schools. Part of it is grant programs, basically subsidizing the teaching of certain things. Part of it is intervening if the federal government thinks that what's being taught violates federal law. So we see that right now with the current administration around issues of students who are trans, and to some extent on issues that the Trump administration sees as, what did they call it? Critical race theory. Remember that?
Yes.
And DEI, et cetera. Right. So there's been this attempt to shape curriculum. We're seeing it also with higher education, right? Intervening with Harvard and Columbia, et cetera. So there is a heavy hand being played, and there have been heavy hands being played that have been played by past administrations. Again, I think it's inconsistent and arguably hypocrisy for the administration to be doing those things. I also think to some extent they're inconsistent with the statutes that they're trying to enforce. But again, when we elect a given administration, we expect them to carry out the policies that Donald Trump ran on critical race theory, anti-DEI, anti,
Yeah.
what do they call it? Gender philosophy. I forget what they called it.
No idea.
But gender
Don't I
ideology.
try not to
Yes.
kill brain cells trying to make sense of any of it.
Right. So to some extent, I would expect them to, I guess my point is, to some extent, I expect them to come in and do those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, my brain cells are obviously suffering as well.
Yeah.
And you expect them to interpret, for example, Title IX differently than the Biden administration interpreted Title
Yeah.
IX, but within limits, right?
Yeah.
Within the range of the reasonable. And I think we've gotten beyond the range of the reasonable, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And like what I tell people, I mean, I'm fairly involved in my children's school, and I tell them like that there's not a person at DOE that's like writing the curriculum for your kid's second grade class. If you have a problem with what's being taught in your classroom, talk to your teachers. If you feel like you need to talk to the administration, if you really need to, go to the board, go to a board of ed meeting, right? I mean, there's so many other local ways that your curriculum is shaped, and we see that playing out at the local level as well with book bans and all these other things. So start there. If you're not happy, there isn't a person at DOE necessarily writing the curriculum for your child's classroom,
Yeah.
and these cuts aren't getting to that.
I would take out the necessarily. There's no one writing the curriculum in DOE. But you also absolutely talk to the teacher, the principal, the local school board, and if necessary, if it's appropriate, talk to your local state legislators. But
Yep.
yes, those are the people who have impact on what's being taught in your schools much, much more than anything taking place in the U.S. Department of Education.
Okay, so I think we can say if Linda McMahon says they're getting these crazy curriculums out of your schools, that's not really what's happening here. She also talks about bureaucratic bloat. We're getting rid of bureaucratic bloat. So from what you know so far and what these professionals did, also the fact that DOE's got a quite small staff compared to other cabinet, do we really think we're getting, in the grand scheme of things, is this achieving a large amount of, eliminating bureaucratic bloat?
Yeah. Well, we discussed the issue of efficiency earlier. I imagine there's no bloat left.
Yeah.
This point with 2,000 people. I don't know how much bloat there was when it was 4,000 people. Bureaucracy is a bad word, right? We're supposed to not like bureaucracy. But really, bureaucracy is, those people on the other end of the phone that answer our questions about student loans, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are public servants who are part of the institution that Congress created in order to accomplish certain things, and they're the ones who accomplish it. And they are bureaucrats to that extent, right? They're carrying out their duties in a way that is consistent with their job titles, et cetera, right? The word bureaucracy probably shouldn't have the negative connotations we have, but, obviously we've all faced government bureaucracies that are unpleasant to work with. And I think
Yeah.
that that's why we assign those that ill meaning to the word. The word bloat, of course, is just a charged word, right? It implies inefficiency. It implies that there's too many people to do too few things. You mentioned the issue of school vouchers being the main thing you see in Project 2025, and I agree. Basically, what Project 2025 does is it decreases the funding on Title I for low-income students and creates a similar amount of funding for vouchers. And one of the things we know about vouchers is that they mainly go to students who are already attending private schools, who can already afford to pay tuition.
Right.
And they tend to be not those low-income families that we're talking about who receive Title I assistance. Disproportionately, it's shifting money from lower income to higher income families. It's also shifting money, obviously, from supporting public schools to supporting private schools. I should note you didn't jump into this earlier, but the research on private school vouchers, on larger scale private school and more recent private school voucher plans. So what we've seen is private school vouchers were relatively small and infrequent until about 2 decades ago. Now we've seen this massive expansion across the country in terms of state voucher plans, but also larger voucher plans. So the research that we have on those expanded larger voucher plans is just devastating, particularly in terms of math scores, comparable to the ill effects of COVID-19 or Hurricane Katrina. Just the students who receive these vouchers do much, much poorer on the math achievement tests than they would have if they had stayed in public schools.
Wow.
So we're not talking the expansion of voucher programs is not because we have wonderful results of academic results from the vouchers. We have the opposite. And
Yeah.
it should be red flags and for policymakers. But I think what we've seen is within the Republican Party, there's been this shift from this bipartisan support for public schooling to an orthodoxy of not necessarily defunding public schools, but putting money into these private school voucher plans. So a Republican who refuses to do the latter can easily be primaried in a lot of these states with a lot of money backing that primary opponent who's going to support vouchers. So we've seen that most notably in Texas, but also in other states.
Yeah, I was listening. There was something I was listening to about, or I was reading something that maybe it was ProPublica put something out about the amount of public funding Texas gives to private schools. I mean, it's huge compared to a lot of other states. The amount of their funds, their state funds that they devote to private schools, and the public schools are really suffering there. Like I've seen conversations of people whose kids can't get into kindergarten because they don't have room in the public schools because they're just gutting them by shifting funds and crippling them.
In Texas, what you're describing sounds like Arizona. That's the place that I know ProPublica, I think is how they pronounce it. Yeah. I know that they did a piece on Arizona, and Arizona has one of the longest standing private school choice or voucher programs in the country. Texas just adopted theirs. I don't know if it's implemented yet, but they just adopted theirs, and it is, as you say, it is a major program. It is a major expansion of putting money into private schools.
Is Arizona the state that they mention in the Project 2025 DOE chapter?
I don't remember.
I think Arizona might be. And then I looked up, like, how does Arizona rank on education? And it's like it's like last, maybe second to last. I mean, it's really down there. I'm like, so it makes no sense that you're going to champion this model when anyone can just Google states on public education and see that it has worked out terribly. I don't understand it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have those careful studies that I mentioned about the harmful effects of vouchers. The issue I mentioned around Title I funding about the red states being the places that rely more on the federal money, right? Yeah. That there's also a correlation there in that red states are the states that are most likely to adopt voucher policies because as I mentioned, Republican orthodoxy right now is to adopt voucher policies. So we have this conflation of Republican states, less money going into education, less money in their economies as a rule. Wealthier states tend to be bluer these days. And voucher programs and disentangling the causation and lower income, the best way to predict academic outcomes is to look at wealth. Wealthier communities, wealthier schools, wealthier families tend to have better academic outcomes. They have those opportunities to learn I talked about earlier, the opportunity gift, right? And so that's a long-winded way of saying that if you have a fairly low income, low resourced state, it's going to have lower academic outcomes, whether or not it adopts voucher policies. Mm-hmm. But what we know from that research I mentioned earlier is that the voucher policies make it worse.
Yeah. Well, this has been eye-opening, and I really appreciate your time kind of getting into details of all this and how it works and setting the record straight. What I like to do is kind of give everyone who's listening an opportunity to get involved. If they're listening to this and they're getting a little fired up and they want to make sure that they do what they can to preserve education, especially access to education. I mean, what you just described, the DOE was basically designed to provide equal access to education. And yet we still, in the wealthiest country in the world, find ourselves in a place where you can determine educational outcomes with good probability based on what type of family you're born into, and it's not acceptable. So if people are fired up, what would you tell them to do? Is there a newsletter they can subscribe to make sure they're informed as to what's happening here? Are there groups advocating they may want to sign up for their newsletter or donate to? Or is there a bill they should call their congressman about right now?
I'm going to use the newsletter question to plug the Policy Center because we do have a newsletter that comes out twice a week. So if you go to nepc.colorado.edu, you could sign up for our newsletter there.
Awesome.
But I also want to your question also is a nice way for me to mention that most opportunity gaps, going back to what I was saying earlier, most of the opportunity gaps that students face are created by inequalities outside of schools.
Right.
Most of these education, when we look at the differences between schools in terms of overall test scores,
Hmm.
average test scores, the differences in school resources and teacher experience, et cetera, account for part of those gaps. But the bigger explanation for if we were talking about regression models, right? Statistical explanation.
Yes.
The biggest statistical explanation for differences in student test scores from school to school is outside school poverty. So we're talking about poverty, concentrated poverty, racialized poverty in this country.
Hmm.
It's that part of our policymaking that drives school inequalities even more than the school inequalities themselves, right?
Hmm.
That drives the outcome inequalities. So if you think about, for example, the cuts to Medicaid
Yeah.
that were in this One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that's going to impact student test scores in a
Yes.
pretty significant way. Now, part of it is family wealth. Poverty is going to be increased because of that. Part of it is Medicaid actually funds a lot of the health services that are provided to kids through their schools.
Yep.
So there's a cut there. Medicaid is, I think, like the fourth biggest federal program for schools, right? You don't think about Medicaid, you think of Title I and
Yeah.
IDE. Part of the activism, part of what we need to do as citizens, as residents of the US, is to focus on those issues of inequality and poverty that are driving these outcomes so strongly. But in terms of the practical, there was the Trump administration, if you followed news over the last couple of weeks around education, they tried to withhold $6.8 billion that had been allocated by the Congress for various programs, including things like after-school programs for English learners. And there was pushback there. And the Trump administration initially released, out of that 6.8, I think they initially released like $1.5 billion saying, okay, well, you could use it for this, but not these other things.
Yeah.
And then just a couple days ago, they released the rest of it. And part of that is because of pressure from Republican senators in red states
Okay.
saying, we need this money. And I mean, it's bizarre to me that providing a high quality education for our children should be viewed as a partisan issue. And for
Yeah.
a long time, it really was not.
Yeah.
Teacher unions, for example, which are demonized by Republicans, they endorsed and supported many Republicans in the past, Republicans who supported public education. But what we've seen in recent years is this extreme political and financial pressure for Republicans to support privatization, mainly through vouchers, and not to support public schools as strongly. So in my view, the real work needs to be done by constituents in red districts, in red states, constituents of electeds at the local, state, and federal levels, trying to bring Republicans back into the larger societal commitment to
Yeah.
public education. Of course, there are varying levels of commitment to public education among elected Democrats as well. But I think that partisan splitting is just really, really bad for the future of the country.
Well, thank you. That actually is a great spot to end this discussion, because that's kind of why I started this podcast, was to get into issues and actually just talk about the issues of themselves, completely removed from a party or a candidate, just what works, what doesn't, what's actually the facts of the matter here. And with that, I really appreciate everything you've brought to this discussion and given me a lot of a better understanding as to what's happening with the DOE at the federal level, and what we should be watching out for. So thank you so much. I will absolutely, when I post my show notes, I'll include a link to your website so people can sign up for the newsletter. And I will be signing up myself too, so I can stay informed on this. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for inviting me.